Hello, Epic Slow. How's it going?
Woo!
Happy Galentine's Day to my gals out there.
Like the best day of the year for women.
Yeah.
I've learned that.
Ladies
past
for
years.
ladies, yeah. Well, thanks for having us tonight. We know you guys have marked this on your calendars. Romantic relationships.
Gotta be there.
Day before Valentine's Day. So thanks for being here. We've been excited to prepare and to speak with you guys. We're not going to share our story tonight, but a shortened version is we dated twice, broke up once.
Married once.
Married once. Yeah, we're married. That was given by our wedding photo. Our first date was at Zorro's at Shell Beach.
Anybody been there? Anybody?
It's a good spot.
No?
Good for breakfast.
Oh, you gotta go. Good spot.
That was in 2015. Matt proposed at the Elfin Forest in Los Osos. Good story. He did really well.
Honestly, it's one of my proudest moments, probably of my life. I crafted.
A good proposal.
Yeah, I'm not gonna lie. You know, only did it once, so
Yeah.
I had to get it right. Yeah.
Yeah, and we got married December of 2017. So here we are. We're going to talk about romantic relationships, and we're going to co-speak. So we're going to go back and forth. So Matt is going to share kind of some context for the night.
Yeah. Yeah, this is a first for us too. We've never done a I don't even know what to call this, collab, dynamic duo. I don't know. We've never spoken before, and so this is new for us. So give us grace as we navigate it. But yeah, so we're talking about romantic relationships, #goals tonight, and how we're gonna do it is we're gonna look at it. We're gonna look at 4 topics. Is what we're gonna do. So we're gonna look at preparing for romantic relationships, singleness, dating, and marriage. So we're gonna talk about those 4 topics. But how we decided to break it down tonight is I'm gonna introduce the topic and then share some commentary just on the cultural landscape or kind of modern day perspective on the topic, just to kind of give us understanding of what are we hearing? What are the narratives that we're hearing on this topic, just in the world? Not necessarily from the Christian perspective or Christian lens. I'm going to share that perspective on just the modern perspective, cultural landscape, and then Kelly will speak to the Christian kind of lens or narratives that we might ascribe to that topic. So we'll look at how do you prepare for romantic relationships? What does the world say about how we prepare for romantic relationships? And we're what might it look like? What's the Christian perspective on how to prepare for the relationships? And as I share kind of pieces on the cultural landscape, I'll even just say a few words. There's some things that actually I'll pray and then I'll do that thing before I get going too much. All right, Heavenly Father, Lord, we just thank you for just a chance to even talk about a topic that is really relevant just to life. And Father, we do desire to just learn. We desire to see you. We desire for your Spirit to guide us through romantic relationships and the ways that we think about them, the ways that we live them out. We want to follow you in all aspects of our life. Not just categorically, but in all things that we do. And so we just invite you to this time. Pray that you might have something for us tonight. Pray things in Jesus' name. Amen. So a word about culture. So it's interesting. So to prepare even for tonight, I went to the library on Monday, and I was like, what does the world say about dating? And it's interesting, I actually picked up a few books. I've already read one a while ago. One book I read was called A Modern Romance by Aziz Ansari. A hilarious book. Hilarious. Actually super insightful though. He does a ton of research on what it looks like to date in the modern world. So pick that up. I'm gonna reference some of him tonight. I picked another book up called The American Hookup. Just looking at the kind of hookup culture that we kind of now live in. So I picked that up. We'll hear. I'll share a few thoughts from that book. Another book I read a few years ago is called The Defining Decade by this, she has a PhD, her name's Meg J. She has a famous TED Talk. She just kind of talks about how the defining decade is your 20s and how there's just significant decisions and things that you make or think about in that time. And she has one whole section on love that I'll bring in and reference. And then the other thing was there's this, it's called the National Marriage Project, and it's a totally secular research that has been done on just the landscape of marriage, like in the U.S. And so took a look at that, and so I'm gonna bring in some pieces from there too. So I'm gonna do my best to try to represent the cultural landscape, given some of the research that I've done. Do my best, and I'll just make a comment that even as I was studying and reading about, doing some research about from those different authors and some of those studies, I just want to share a word about culture. I think it's just so important for us, even as Christians, to be students and learners of our culture. We have to be students and understand what is going on. Even knowing, like for me, like looking at some of the things that they're talking about and researching, I actually found things that they're saying that I'm like, man, that's really good. I actually super agree with that. Or like, I didn't even realize that sociologists or psychologists or counselors were asking those types of questions. And the findings that they had actually even supports kind of some Christian narratives or biblical narratives that we see that actually give support to maybe certain perspectives that Christians that we just kind of throw around, but we just throw around them without much actual research. But there are sociologists and psychologists that are actually doing the research that's actually really helpful for us as we even navigate dating. It's almost like, well, I have a thought on dating. It's like, this actually isn't just the Christian perspective, but this is actually something that was studied that has some backing to it. And so I just think it's really important for us, even as we think about just certain narratives, to be students of the culture, to be students of what's going on around us, because I also think that as we know what's going on and hold the lens of, this is kind of what the world's thinking about this is kind of how I bring in my Christian lens, it can help us to engage and speak to the culture, and then be able to affirm things that are true that we actually see in the culture, but then also to maybe call out things in the culture and say, actually, I disagree with that, and this is why I bring in my Christian lens. So I just encourage us, even, this is almost like a case study of like, what does it look like for us to learn, be students of the culture, of what's going on around us, and what does it look like to reconcile our Christian lens or Christian perspective with the things that are going on around us. So kind of just a note on why we even wanted to approach the topic like this. And so, anyways, let's talk about preparing for romantic relationships, though, just to kick us off. So, how do we prepare for romantic relationships? Again, we live in a world where there's cultures and there's values that clash, and sometimes that they actually agree on. And so, even some of the things I share, I try not to share from like a stereotypical point of view, but actually with some things that I found. So I feel like in the culture, how do you prepare for romantic relationships? There's definitely, you guys can nod your heads with me if you're like, yeah, I feel that. There's like the financially, the vocationally, there's the professionally piece. Well, how do you best prepare for a romantic relationship? Well, you need to figure out what you want to do, what career path you want to go on, before you should even maybe commit to someone or even think about dating someone. This therapist, so Meg J, in The Defining Decade, she says, regardless, the best time to work on your marriage or your romantic relationships is before you have one. So even she kind of advocates for you, like before you even get in one, like now's the time for you to start preparing before you're actually in it. She even shares in her book, she says, in her book, she's like, these chapters are about being choosy about the right things when you can still think clearly about claiming your life. Besides, like work, good relationships don't just appear when we're ready. It may take a few thoughtful tries before we know what love and commitment really are. So I really was moved by even her perspective of like, you need to be choosy, almost. And her kind of, what she talks about in her book is her even saying, oh, you need to be choosy. And part of that is, well, what do you want to be choosy about? And that actually requires work for you to maybe look at some of the past relationships that maybe you had, and giving an honest look at it and saying what were things that were good, what were maybe things that weren't good, and then making the decisions of like, okay, well, this past relationship, this wasn't good, so if that's the case, then maybe I should take note of that, so that as I prepare for these romantic relationships in the future, you already kind of have a criteria, you kind of have already made certain decisions when you're not actually in the relationship itself. You actually become a student of maybe your past relationships and learn from them. Other things are, this is interesting, what no one tells 20-somethings is that finally and suddenly you can pick your own families. You can create your own families, and these are the families that life will be about. These are the families that will define the decades ahead. In this, she had a whole chapter on picking your family, and she even just talks about like being a student of your family. What are the family dynamics that you come from, and even what are what's even the things that are maybe broken in your family when you're dating somebody or entering a romantic relationship. The reality is that they also are a part of a family, and if you do end up being with that person, maybe end up marrying that person, you're also marrying their family. You're also they're going to be your in-laws. You're going to be seeing them. And so even part of something she talked about was trying to figure out, answer the questions of like, what are the things that are, what are the things of my spouse, not only my spouse or the person I want to be with, what are the things of their family that I would love to be true? Does that make sense? Of almost you have this opportunity to pick the type of family you'd like to be with. And she just kind of talks about how you should probably figure that out. What type of family would you like to be with? So she had a whole chapter on that. Other thing she talks about was whatever.
Add something.
Oh yeah, go ahead.
I will say though, there is a point where some people can't choose the brokenness in their families. So there is sometimes a point where you might choose to like love and marry someone, even if their family is broken, and even be like a redeeming part of that story. So just a caveat, maybe if you have a broken family or it feels like, oh man, like no one would want to be in my family, like there is a really beautiful part of choosing that person regardless. So.
And I would say like that perspective is, that is something that's different, I think, too, because as she writes in her book, she doesn't necessarily bring in those thoughts, that's the thing.
To my part.
Yeah, maybe, yeah. But it's and that's the tensions of as we maybe read certain books, there's the tension of, I see what she's saying, it's not fully true, I see where she's going, and then this is where you bring in the Christian lens. I'll just kind of wrap up with this about how to prepare. She said in another comment, she said 20-somethings who aren't at least a little scared about their relationships are often the ones who are being the least thoughtful. Which I was like, dang, that's interesting. Like, you're basically making the argument of like, this is a really big deal. You should be super thoughtful on dating. This isn't just like whatever, like, it's no biggie. Like, she's like, the person who's a little, like, you should at least be a little anxious about the conversation of who you're with. It's okay to almost be worried or to be thinking about those things a lot. If you're not worried about it at all, she's almost like, you don't care enough. You should care more. Which I was like, hey, I actually super agree with that perspective. And so, anyways, those are some thoughts, I guess, on preparing for romantic relationships. She talks about, just almost fighting for the, what's it called? Yeah, there's things she mentions that I'm like, I actually think I like that. But anyways, you want to talk a little bit about maybe the Christian narrative or perspective or thoughts on kind of that topic?
Sure. Yeah, so as we were thinking about like having this Christian kingdom lens of how we prepare for romantic relationships, the word that comes to mind is wisdom, like living out of this place of wisdom. And so something to consider as you're preparing for a romantic relationship is knowing who you are, like getting to know yourself. If you're going to enter a relationship with another person, you're going to be learning who they are, and at the same time, if you're trying to learn who you are, there's almost like this conflicting effort of like what you should be spending your time doing. So I think it's important to get to know yourself. So some ways to do this would be to draw out like a life map. We're going to give some really practicals. Matt and I were like, okay, could be good to give you guys something to actually work through. So a life map, like we did this, I think, in a large group first quarter, like draw like a road of your life and think through significant moments that shaped you or things that scare you or things that you dream about, things you wish that were true of your life, right? Some of those big moments that shaped you. there's something called the 5 H's. If you're taking notes, this could be even a good question on like a one-on-one or a plus dollar pals date. But the 5 H's. So it'd be heritage, heroes, high points, hard times, and hand of God. So being able to think through like, yeah, what is my family background? Where did my parents come from? What did they grow up with? What's their culture? Thinking about the really like great points in your life that you feel like God was really present there. Working through hard things. I think a lot of the time we have wounds, and a lot of the time when you brush up against someone else, sometimes those wounds can be like reopened, and so it's good to even know those spots in your life that can maybe be triggered, and kind of work through that with yourself and with the Lord. Another thing to do is looking through personality tests, classic Myers-Briggs, all those different things. But even good to put language to kind of some of your habits and behaviors. If maybe you're dating someone who's like literally the opposite, and you're like, what? There's someone that's different than me? Could be good to just know like who you are and how you work and how you function, and being able to put language to that is really helpful. Another thing in relationships is you're probably going to have conflict. In any relationship with a human being, there's probably going to be moments where there's something that happens that you're not on the same page, or you're upset, or it hurts your feelings. So it's good to think through.
Never happened with us, though.
No, never. We're perfect. We never have arguments.
Yeah, crazy.
So it's good to know like what's your conflict resolution style. Are you like more passive? Do you hide? Are you aggressive? Do you gossip about people? Right, kind of knowing like what's your tendency and what is a good way for you to step into some of those habits and make them healthy. Because with any relationship, it's good to know how you're going to come into those moments. Another thing is just your communication style, your tendencies. Knowing how you communicate, when you best communicate. Things like that. You guys are college students, you know what that means. But just kind of thinking through like, who am I and how do I communicate, and what's been what's been taught to you, what have you learned, what have you picked up through the years. Another important thing is, which Matt didn't mention this, but in his notes, one of the psychologists said, before you date someone, like, it's the time to prepare to change the things about yourself you want to change. And I think it's good to strive to be the person that you want to date, right? Like, sometimes we can have these lists of like, I want this person that has like, all of these great qualities, and then you should look at yourself and think, am I a person that has all the qualities that I'm wanting in another person? And really be able to strive to be that person. And even spend the time that you have preparing for a relationship to kind of invest into that future relationship by investing into who you are. Another thing is being deeply rooted in Jesus and abiding in him. I think, being on your own, there's so much beauty in discovering who God's made you to be, really deepening that relationship with him before inviting someone else into that. I think, the strong foundation in Christ is something that is super valuable before you add another broken person into your life. So that's just something to consider. A few weeks ago, Lindsay talked about the importance of community and friendship. And I think in preparing for a dating, you want to have friends that are going to speak truth into your life and are willing to give you wisdom and counsel. Maybe to even say like, hey, am I in a place to start dating this person? Or like, is there anything you see in my life that I could grow in before stepping into that? It could be a mentor, it could be peers, could be parents, people that you trust. But really having just openness to be able to ask people in your life and invite community into your life. Because when you start dating someone, you'd hope that they'd be able to speak into your life in that relationship and be able to give you wisdom. So even before you start dating someone, I think developing your convictions beforehand is so important. I think it's easy to be swayed by someone when you're feeling the feels and you're like, yeah, whatever you say, like, I agree with you. But I think it's really good to have strength on your own to know what you stand for and what your values are. And so I think, developing a vision for what you want your relationship to look like. Like when you think about your dating life, what do you hope is true of it? When it comes to like things like boundaries or time you want to spend or goals that you have, it's good to really have like a conviction of what you want that to look like before dating someone and then being like, wait, I kind of forgot what I stand for. So that's always really important. And then this is something that Matt's really passionate about, but I think it's true. When Matt and I were dating, he was like, so I've been saving money. I was like, oh. It's like, you just never know the future, you know? So I'm just letting you know I got some money saved. I was like, oh, nice. Like, this guy's been saving money. And even for guys and for girls, I think even setting yourself up financially to be able, like, if you do want to get married after college or you want to, like, move on your own and, like, start your career and start a family, it's just good to be wise and to have some money saved.
Can I speak?
Yeah, you can.
Can I elaborate on it? I'm so excited about it. I just think, so how do I word this? Savings is important. Even if you're not even interested in anyone, it's just, I'm gonna get very practical. If you get that paycheck, even if it's not that much, and you just put, say it's a $200 paycheck, we'll go real low, right? Even 10% of that, right? So it's like, actually, that's all I made. Sorry, $100.
College, man.
I'm $100.
College.
That's true. When I was Sandwich Factory at Polydelic, my checks were like $180. Anyways. You put away 20% of that, right? Say you're not even in a relationship, you're not even interested in anybody, but you're saving that money. Say you end up saving, like, it ends up being like, 10 months you save $20 or whatever, that's a couple $100, right? Now, say, fellas or ladies, I'm actually kind of interested in this person. I actually think I might want to take this person on a date. Hey, and I'm prepared because I got that $2 bills ready. I've been prepared for this moment. Shoot, I go take you to a real nice dinner, We ain't even just doing McDonald's. We go, or Firestone. I might take you somewhere nicer. So, fellas, I'm saying, you don't even have to have a girl on your mind, but that intentionality, even if it feels like nothing, $10 a month, $20 a month, whatever, throw that set to the side so that you're prepared, so that when that moment does come, you have the freedom to actually go out on a date. You have the security of actually knowing you can afford that date. You ain't being like, actually, I ain't got that money. Hey, mom, dad. You're actually like, no, this is intentional. I've been preparing for this. Right? And then you take that even further. If you actually you actually see yourself wanting to get married, you ain't gonna just need a couple $100, right? You're gonna need a little bit more than that. Rings are cash money. So if you want to get down to the nitty gritty, you're gonna need a couple G's to be able to pay for that. So that intentionality, even if you're not in a relationship or even dating or even interested in anybody. That intentionality, though, now, even you're 18, 19 years old or whatever, you save monthly or whatever, it's going to go a long way.
And I think that speaks to just general stewardship and being prepared and living out of wisdom. And our landing point is our goal should always be sanctification, meaning becoming more like Christ, pursuing spiritual growth, not satisfaction. So you're not preparing for a relationship hoping like this relationship will totally satisfy me. Once I get it, I'll be totally fulfilled. But it's like, the goal is to be more like Jesus and to let this process be something that sanctifies you.
All right, let's talk about singleness. We're going to have to fly through this. Yeah. This is the first time we're doing this co-thing. So what does singleness look like? What should it look like? How do Christians view, how does the world view singleness? Essentially, defining decade, it talks about today, the 20-somethings. So 20-somethings just meaning in the decade of your 20s. 20-somethings spend more time single than any generation in history. The average age of getting married for women is 26. The average for men is about 28, with more than half of adults marrying over the age of 25. So it's just kind of the reality of like, well, you're in your 20s, in your early 20s, it's expected to be single. It's not even something to freak out about. Right? From the ages of, average for women, 26, 28. We got married, I was 25, you were 26, so we fall even in that category. So I think even from the cultural landscape singleness is actually to be expected for 20-somethings, especially in your early to mid 20s. And I think, other things about singleness, so in that I think the culture is even saying like, hey, there's nothing wrong with being single, man. Like, it's cool, it's fine. It's actually respected. It's like, it makes sense actually that you're single. You need to focus on your career. You need to figure out who you want to be. You gotta finish and graduate college. You need to figure out where you want to live, etc. You need to develop yourself or change those things you want to change so that you're ready. So I think singleness, just even from the cultural landscape, even looking at some data, from the culture standpoint, it's actually to be expected. Maybe there is obviously the data goes from 26 to 28, so maybe you start feeling a little bit more unsettled once you're in the 25, 26, 27. Like if you're single, then sure, culture might be like, so are you dating? Like, are you with anybody? Is that something that's on your mind? But at least from like 20 to 25, in terms of the landscape, if you're single from 20 to 25, 26 even, the world's not going to really freak out on you. It's just like, that makes sense. You doing you, that's good. Even the independence, like I feel like is a big value. The pursuing your dream, the traveling is super important. Like if you're like, hey, I'm actually, I'm doing a lot of traveling in my early 20s. They're like, tight, do that. That's great. Like do it now before you settle down, or those types of things that we hear. I even think like the not being tied down. Like, that's something that the world says, like, that's good, man. Don't let them tie you down. Ray J song, he ain't gonna tie me down. You know what I mean? He ain't gonna tie me down. It's fine. And so I think there's those values of independence that we have within the U.S. of just like the you do you, like it's all good. Nothing really wrong with being single, I feel like, from the cultural landscape.
Yeah, and I think kind of this Christian perspective, now this is more Christian culture, not quite biblical, but Christian culture. I think there are voices that speak to singleness in Christian culture that are loud and overt, but sometimes are also quiet and subtle. So for example, people often talk about marriage as if it's the goal or a guarantee, with language like maybe a pastor is like, when you get married one day, or like maybe like your auntie from church is like, oh, like I can't wait for you to have children. Like there's kind of this expectation that you will get married and you will have kids. Like it's a guarantee, like it's a goal. And I think from that narrative, I think often single Christians can often feel, maybe they feel guilty for being single. Maybe they're like, yeah, I want to get married, but like I'm single and that's not where I'm at right now. So it might feel like this sense of shame or embarrassment of like, something's wrong with me. Maybe that makes that person not feel worthy, or they're not normal, or maybe they need to change something about themselves for someone to like be interested in them. So that's what happens, I think, when the church has this focus on marriage being like varsity and singleness is like JV or something like that. But that's actually not what we believe to be true. So I think people can often feel excluded from conversations, not being seen when people say, even when people give sermons about marriage, it's like, well, I'm not married, so how do I fit into this conversation? So I think often people can say hurtful things like, just keep praying, like keep holding on, there's hope for you. And it's like, Matt has a really good friend, Matt and I, she's in her 40s and she's not married, and people will often be like, don't lose hope, like keep praying. And she's like, that's offensive. Like I am single and I'm happy and I don't think God has that for me. And don't like look down on me because I'm a person who isn't married. Like I'm a woman, I'm independent, I have a career, I have my life. So I think there's kind of that undertone, thank you, of like something's wrong with you if you aren't married or aren't dating. And so I think that can lead to is this dissatisfaction, almost feeling like you're constantly waiting and you can't fully arrive until you've like found your life partner. And I think culture plays into that of like the Bachelor fairy tale of like, my person's out there. But I think in the church, we think that singleness should be celebrated just as much as dating relationships and marriage relationships are celebrated. God does not favor married people. He doesn't think they're better. He doesn't bless them more. We're not entitled to marriage or having children. It's not the Christian's only ambition to be married and to have kids. There's so much more God has for us than that one aspect of life. So I think when we reframe this narrative and celebrate singleness, and maybe include the single person in our language of like having talks about marriage, even in this talk, we wanted to include singleness to say this is a perfectly good option when you think about your relationships. So when we reframe that narrative, we see that God celebrates the single person, and he celebrates the person who might not want to get married. God celebrates the person who doesn't want to have children or who can't have children. We begin to see people in the body of Christ differently and accept them. Maybe someone doesn't have a desire for marriage. Maybe they feel like, I don't have attraction towards anyone. I want to be single my whole life. We can celebrate that and say that God blesses it. If someone maybe has same-sex attraction and chooses not to marry in their life, we aren't surprised by that. If we have this narrative, we have a category that we can like celebrate them and celebrate their singleness and have them be a significant part of the body of Christ. So if you want to look up more scripture, we're not going to read a ton tonight, but it's 1 Corinthians 7, and Paul talks about kind of the gift of singleness and how he encourages people to remain single as to not be like distracted by the world and to serve Christ. So I think it actually gives a beautiful picture of singleness. And heck, like Jesus never got married. Like he is our example, and
Paul
wasn't married, right? So I think we just wanted to communicate tonight that singleness should be celebrated, and there's nothing wrong with you if you're not dating, if you don't want to date, if you never date. If that is a desire of yours, like I think it's great to pray for marriage and to expect that God might show up in that way in your life. But I think even just to support your single friends, like that's not a requirement. You're not entitled to that, and we shouldn't like elevate marriage over singleness.
That's good. We could go off, and I felt we could go off on that topic. Just the painful, the hurtful things that the church has done to single people, in isolating them is like, man, it's subtle. Even in the like pastor that gets up and shows starts things off by showing a picture of their family. Like even things like that can begin painting a narrative of this is what your life needs to look like. You know what I mean? So it's even just subtle things. So we wanted to mention that. Even knowing that, like, even you look at the data, like the numbers of you'll probably be single for like early to mid, even late 20s. And like, as you even carry through that time, if that is what ends up happening, we want, even just you to know, like, God still loves you. God celebrates you. Like the season that he has you in, like live it up, steward it well. Don't be in a rush. Just look at your life. Don't be like, Lord, what the heck is going on? But it can be like, Lord, this is what you've given me. How can I steward this? So just reframing the singleness narrative is, I feel like, just huge.
And I think parts of what culture values of like, go travel, like don't be tied down, it kind of feels negative. But like Matt and I both went on stint as single people and had these great experiences before we got married. And I'm so thankful I got time in my singleness to like serve the Lord, make great girlfriends, have a ministry that was like, took a lot of my time, and I didn't have to like go home at night because of this guy. Like I could just do what I wanted to do, and God really blessed those years of my ministry. So I think, there's so much to benefit from your single years.
It's real. One of my roommates, when I was graduating, I felt like God was leading me to move overseas and to work in ministry full time. And I remember one of my good buddies, he also had a similar desire. He was like, man, I would love to do something like that. And I was like, then come, man. Like, let's go. Like, why not? And he's like, bro, Hannah. I'm like, oh, shoot, man. You tied down, brother. But I ain't tied down, so I would go. But I celebrate him, though, too. Like, they ended up getting married, and I love them. And, like, the path that God led them on is great. But I'm like, man, oh, shoot. Dang. Freedom. Like, I can make this decision. You're right. I don't have to stay. I can leave. And I'm like really, really grateful. Like, I wouldn't trade those years for nothing. Like, goodness gracious. Like, I'm so glad that I wasn't in too much of a rush to get out of that season. Let's talk about dating, though. So, I'm gonna throw a slide up, which I think is hilarious. This is from. If you were asking someone out on a first date, which method of communication would you be most likely to use to get in contact? This is a question that was actually from a 2013 study by Match.com. This is in the book, A Modern Romance by Aziz Ansari. And so phone call, face-to-face text, and email. So if you're over 30 years old, 52% said that they would use the phone. They would call up that person to ask them out on a date. On the contrary, under 30, 23% of people said that they would call them on the phone. Face-to-face, for over 30, 28% said They go face to face. Under 30 said 37%. Text messaging is where you see the big difference. Over 30 would say 8% would send a text. 32% under 30 would send a text. And then it's got to slide email in there. 7% of people over 30 will use an email.
Ask how poly.edu.
Yeah, it's like, what's your subject line? Like, want to go out on a date? Yeah, like, what you doing Friday? Like, Friday plans?
Can I get those notes?
Yeah.
And the date?
So it's interesting to think about email. Another one, though, is interesting. Breaking up. How about breaking up? If you were to break up with someone, what method of communication would you be most likely to use to break up with them? This survey is of 18 to 30-year-olds. 18 to 30-year-olds. So you got 25% of people would text. 1 in 4.
That's rude. Okay, boys, don't freaking do that.
Will break up over text. 20% said they do it over a direct message, over a DM. 20%, right? All right, then we got email. Email sliding in again with 11% people said they do email. 18% said face-to-face, 15% phone call, and 11% said other. Dang, that's a trip. So yeah, you think about the landscape of what's going on in the world right now. People break up over. It's a trip too, because like Aziz Ansari does a bit in his stand-up where he basically asks everyone like, "Hey, make some noise if you would prefer to be broken up over text. You know, make some noise." And like, there's like some people making noise, you know, not a lot. And then he does the same for like, DM, and then he does the same for a phone call, and then he does the same for face-to-face. And like most people in the audience obviously make noise for the face-to-face. Like they're like, yeah, I'd rather be broken up face-to-face. But the data shows that even though they want that, they ain't doing it. They are copping out. They are sending the text. Go to the next slide. There's this quote from the book. It says, speaking about the data, it says the most common reason people gave for breaking up via text or social media was that it is less awkward. A lot of people who responded acknowledged that they've broken up with their partners via text or social media to avoid the stress and the conflict. Super interesting, just commentary there. I feel like that does say something about our generation or the landscape that we live in now. It's just that when we think about dating, I just want to avoid the stress, avoid the conflict, avoid the uncomfortable situation. I'll just send a text, call it good. Hopefully I never have to see this person ever again. I'm just gonna ghost them. You know, like walk by, I don't even see you, right? Show up in class, just not even acknowledge their existence. I think that is part of the cultural landscape within dating, which is really interesting. There's other things I wanted to comment on. Actually, I'll say, I won't go to the next slide yet. Other things Aziz mentions was at the end of his book, he comes to these conclusions, which I think he actually has some really great advice. Some things he says, finding someone today is probably more complicated and stressful than it was for previous generations, but you're also more likely to end up with someone who you're really excited about. He says that. And he does this whole thing. There's another chart on like he surveyed people who are married, and basically like, how did you meet your spouse? And there's this whole chart. I was gonna share it, but decided not to. About like, did you meet them just like in your neighborhood, like you were neighbors, you know? Or did you meet in college? Did you meet like at work? Or did you meet online? And obviously as time has gone on, like the online is trending like super, super high. So a lot of people are dating and meeting online. Like that's just where the trends are going. And then obviously the things that are trending down is like, just like they're your neighbor. Like that's just not the story. But back in the day, it'd be like who you married was like, well, you know, Betty lived on the corner. So we just, I saw her as I went down to the market every day. And our parents were great friends, whatever. Yeah, that's my Aziz Ansari bit. Other things he says is, he mentions to treat potential partners like actual people, not like bubbles on a screen. With so many romantic options, instead of trying to explore them all, make sure you properly invest in people and give them a fair chance before moving on to the next one. He has a funny bit even on, are we hanging out or are we going on a date? He's like, just be clear, just say date, quit being so ambiguous. Being like, the girl's like, what is this? What is this even? Just tell me what this is. He gives some tips on how to be clear, give a firm invitation to something specific at a specific time. Anyways, other thing. But other thing I wanted to mention was hookup culture. And we're really running out of time here. Can you go to the next slide about hookup culture? Man, this book was interesting. It's called American Hookup by Lisa Waves, The New Culture of Sex on Campus. He just studies basically on the culture of sex on college campuses, and it is crazy to think about, honestly. Like, I'm shook. Like, even as I was reading the first chapters, I'm like, this is so sad. But something she says is expressing them in the American hookup, in the culture that we live in, the hookup culture that we live in. She says, expressing emotions is seen as weak. Hookup culture, which is strongly masculinized, demands carelessness, rewards callousness, and punishes kindness. There is this culture that we're living in right now within the college campus, and I'm sure you guys can speak to that. Is I just think what she says there is like, gosh, like it's so masculinized. What it means to be a man is to do this, is to have this many amount of partners, or to, you know, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. It's to go to a party, and it's to dance up on some girl, or it's to take her home, or whatever. It's the culture of you hook up with people just for clout. Like, just for, hey, you see that? Yeah, that's who and your boys are like, oh, wow, like, you're really cool. Like, you have all my respect now. Or on vice versa, right? Maybe girls do even the same thing. Like, in the studies, they talk a lot about how the reason for students hooking up with specific people is because of their social status. And them merely not sleeping with them or having a physical relationship with them because they like them, but just because of clout. Like, just because it will give them more respect in their social circles. Other things like it's expected to create emotional distance even from the people who you hook up with, where it's like, what are the steps? Well, you know, you end up maybe being with them or hooking up with them, and then what do you do next? Create that emotional distance. Ghost them. Don't get too attached. Just because the culture rewards callousness. It's the ghost people, right? Where if you end up trying to be kind, the hookup culture says, why are you trying to be kind? Don't be trying to be kind. That's not what this is about, right? Don't bring that kindness into this arena. That's not what we're trying to do here, right? The hookup culture that we live in now is a trip, right? Ghosting is just, we value convenience. We value not being honest, not being straight up, not being transparent, not being vulnerable, not putting yourself out there, because we don't necessarily have the skills on how to actually do those things, right? Even things, I don't really even have time to talk about cohabitation. We're good on time? Okay. So cohabitation, this is even a trip in dating. About half of 20-somethings will live with a romantic partner at least once during their 20-something years. More than half of all marriages will be preceded by cohabitation. This shift has largely been attributed to the sexual revolution and the availability of birth control. There's a representative survey that says nearly half of 20-somethings agreed with the statement, you would only marry someone if he or she agreed to live together with you first, so that you could find out about whether you really got along. So again, to speak to the cultural narratives, the cultural landscape, there is kind of this expectation that like, oh, you're gonna live with the person before you marry. And if you don't live with the person before you marry, then you're kind of like, you don't even really know the person. Like, what's wrong with you? Like, you should, you know, like test drive the car before you buy it. Like that kind of idea, which actually studies like, and in the defining decade, even in modern romance, he speaks about cohabitation, and even in the studies, the data actually shows that those statements are actually just not true. They're not true. Cohabitation does not necessarily mean you are going to be led to a happier marriage. Like data says that actually, if you end up cohabitating or living with multiple people that don't end up being your spouse, the likelihood of your marriage being happy actually goes down. There's some data though that says if the only person you cohabitate with, live with, ends up being your spouse, then the data shows like, okay, there's likely that you will be happy in your marriage. but the narratives or the data doesn't necessarily always support that cohabitation opinion. You need to live with your spouse before you marry them. You have to do that. This data, actually, the secular data shows that that's not necessarily true. And then you're thinking, why is that the case? There's a whole phrase on sliding and not deciding, where it basically says couples end up making these decisions, like major decisions of, whether it's sleeping together, or it's moving in together, it's having children before you get married. There's these sliding, not necessarily deciding decisions. It just talks about how couples just kind of do these decisions. It's like the moment of like, you want to move in? Like, yeah. And then they just do it without necessarily thinking about all of the ramifications of that decision. There's just kind of this like, oh, we just kind of slid into this next decision, and we slid into this, and we slid into this. It's almost like a mindless kind of, we did it, but we didn't really think about it. And the data talks about how if you're sliding in and not actually making these big decisions with much intention, then data shows that that's not going to end up being a good decision for you. So anyway, that was a lot, but there's a lot going on in the cultural landscape of dating. We navigate technology, being able to text and DM, that affects the way that we're dating and breaking up and initiating and all those things. The hookup culture affects the way that we're viewing the physical parts of a relationship, or even the emotional aspects of a relationship. The moving in together, the cohabitating, there's narratives there that is informing, if you're thinking about getting married, then you need to do these things. There's a lot. There's so much to take in with the cultural landscape. It's kind of overwhelming, honestly, as I think about it.
So when we think about the kingdom vision of how God calls us to live, kind of in this, the Bible doesn't talk about dating, but we, again, use wisdom to think about how to live our relationships. And so something that we had really thought about was, as Christians, we should stand out in the midst of society, just in general, but also there should be something that's clearly different about the way that Christians date than how the world dates. So some of the kingdom values is to love God and to love others. So where we see this maybe distance of emotions, like ghosting people, right? We want to really love God and love people by the way that we treat them, the way that we relate with them, the way we enter into relationships with them. Treat others the way you want to be treated, right? The golden rule, thinking about the other person's well-being, their benefit, their happiness, their enjoyment. Resolving conflict is a way to show the concept of forgiveness and reconciliation, fighting for oneness. Not hiding behind your phone, or not just never talking to someone again because it feels hard. But as Christians, we want to be honest, resolve conflict, forgive each other. Live in such a different way. The idea of kindness, living with integrity, right? Having all of these values is something that I think could really make us stand out in our dating. Honor and respecting people. I think men, you have a really cool opportunity to show the world what it looks like to love your sisters well. To show them respect, to respect their boundaries, respect their bodies, respect who they are, their independence, not using them, not even talking about women in a way that's disrespectful to your friends, but being bro, she's a woman and a person that deserves dignity and respect, and being able to be that's different than maybe how I've heard people speak, And then something else is, dating really is a step of faith. We don't want to over-spiritualize it and be wow, grow in your faith through dating. But really, it's not a guarantee when you take a step and ask someone on a date or start a relationship with someone. So it's a way to trust God in a new way, and even to process with another person and with the Lord, learning how to walk in the Spirit, asking God to guide you as you continue to make decisions in your relationship. So not just sliding into the next thing of that feels like I want to do that, but being discerning, asking God what's best, looking in Scripture, asking that wise counsel, being in community, even having your friends know the person you're dating, and being able to speak to their character and things like that. I think walking in the light, having a practice of confession and accountability is really different. I think a lot of the time people's relationships are really private, of this is my thing, no one else is in it. But I think there's a lot of joy in a Christian relationship of inviting the community to speak truth into your life. and yeah, to be able to be a part of that. And so I think the world, or at least like you guys are in college, you see what goes on around you. I just think there's so much more depth and beauty that God wants us to experience in our dating relationships. And dating is always a risk. I always say love is a risk, but is it worth the risk? And it's like, if you start dating someone, it's not guaranteed that you're going to end up with them forever. But if you make good choices and like have integrity in those relationships, hopefully you can walk away from those relationships thinking like, that was really cool for me to learn. And like, I feel like I grew. I was able to look back at that relationship with integrity. Like, I respected that person. We grew together, and be able to kind of move forward and like even thank God for that relationship and that experience, and not feel shame or feel like, I don't know, you made decisions that cause someone else to be hurt in a really deep way. So I think there's so much beauty to be had in dating relationships. There's so much more we could talk about of like, what it's like to date, like who asked who out, like all that stuff. But I feel like you guys know some of those.
The guy's been saving, so you know he's paying, you know?
Yeah.
So.
But girls, you can save too, and you could be like, you know what, we're gonna share this because, you know, maybe he needs to like earn the right to pay for your meal. I don't know. Yeah, girls, you have authority to be like, I'll pay for this one. Yeah, so
I'm driving. I'll pay for you.
You know? Yeah, so just like the landing point for this one is that your dating relationships should really be rooted in your faith. And in those values, you want to be true of your life and have them kind of extend into your dating relationship. Yeah. And dating could lead to marriage, so making those choices can really impact the future, like literally the rest of your life if you end up with that person. So something to think about.
Yeah, there's a lot we can say about that. Should I? No, I shouldn't answer it. I'll answer one thought. Guys, girls, like as you're dating, just even having the perspective of knowing that. So there is weight in the way that the things that happen within that relationship, even say you don't end up being with that person, say you end up being with another person, say that person ends up being with another person. Just the perspective, like if you were to meet, I've heard that, if you were to even meet their future spouse, how would that go? How would you enter into that meeting? Would you be like, hey, how's it going? Like, amazing woman that you have here, and even you feel like, yeah, I treated her with respect, I treated her with love, I honored her in our relationship, and you meet him, even being like, yeah, I think I left her better than, or helped her process and helped her grow in her relationship. I saw her grow a ton at the end of our relationship, and vice versa. Almost like, yeah, at the beginning of our relationship, she really helped me grow in this way, or even helped me become a better person. Like, I feel like, versus sometimes if you leave a relationship and I don't know, you just feel a lot of shame, or like, man, I didn't go about that the right way, or shoot. But I think, and not to bring in shame, obviously there's maybe in the room, like, yeah, there's past relationships that you've had, and you're like, yeah, shoot, I didn't necessarily navigate that the way I wanted to. There's things even that I feel bad about still, or what have you. Like, I recognize that there are weighty things that can happen in romantic relationships that are even traumatic. But I guess it's just in the perspective of, well, in your next one, what might it look like to navigate them differently, and to not necessarily let history repeat itself, because you know about the pain that it has caused and what have you. Which I love that about the Christian narrative, is there's a narrative of new beginnings, and of forgiveness, and of reconciliation, and of, we see the Bible just full of people who were this way and completely transformed by the grace of God and became something completely different. And so I think there's so much hope even within the Christian narrative that we can bring in there. Let's talk about marriage. Talk about marriage? Yeah? Got time for marriage?
Last one.
That's right, last one. Marriage. So marriage has changed over time. Marriage has totally changed over time. Even just looking at numbers, so in 1970, this data is actually from the book The Meaning of Marriage by Tim Keller. So he's a Christian, he's a pastor. But his perspective, he said there's data on 1970, 89% of all births were to married parents, but today only about 60% are. Most tellingly, over 72% of Americans were married in 1960, but only 50% of American adults were in 2008. So he basically just makes this rate of like marriage is declining. The data shows, yeah, marriage is declining within American adults. The divorce rate has doubled since 1960. Other things about marriage changing over time is marriage wasn't always about love. In the book that I was reading, The Marriage, A Brief History is what it was called. It was not brief, it was a thick book. I didn't finish it, obviously, but I was like, man, so why? Dang, girl, you're going in on this. But she's talking about marriage was not always about love. It was sometimes about just like political gain or economic gain. Like, it was just, all right, son, you're gonna marry her because our kingdoms are at war and we need peace. So we're actually gonna get together and unite to become a bigger force. They have a lot of land and we need more land. So you're gonna marry the daughter over there and she's gonna marry, so there's things like peace treaties and just gaining land and gaining wealth and having kids. You're getting married, so maybe you can have kids because you got land and you need laborers to work that land, So it's just for the perspective of not necessarily love, it's just marriage. We need to do this to survive. We need to do this so that our neighbors don't kill us. There's a totally different, almost even history of narrative about marriage that wasn't necessarily always about love. Like, it was even within just this last century even that we really see the boom of marriage is all about love. Like, you need to love your spouse, like that, in terms of the warm feelings, you fall in love. Like, it wasn't always about falling in love. Maybe we were to interviewing people, it's almost just like it made sense, or things like that, which is interesting. Just to think about how the love narrative has really come in and reshaped the way that we think about love. And even I was thinking about that too, of like even when you read some scripture, even sometimes like thinking about what was the cultural narratives about marriage when I read it in scripture at this time is like, that's interesting. That might inform even some of those relationships differently, but given like that history about marriage. But other things so obviously there's a little bit, marriage, what marriage is about has kind of shifted as time has gone on. There's maybe this skepticism towards marriage right now in the cultural landscape, obviously because of the high divorce rate that we see in our country, right? There's this skepticism, almost even not even surprising if someone's like, yeah, it's divorced, married again, or like, that's not surprising to us within the cultural landscape. If someone's been married once, twice, 3, 4 times even, or you had a kid within your first marriage, it's like, that's not new to us. And I know even maybe in this room, like, you've been affected by divorce, and so there is, obviously that's something that is totally informing our culture and how we view marriage. There's other things, that we can talk about, kind of throw out, but like, marriage is, just wants you to be happy, right? There's things that we hear about when maybe a divorce happens, we see it was irreconcilable differences. So maybe we see there's difficulty in the landscape of marriage and learning how to reconcile things or forgive or heal because maybe someone did something really jacked up. Then there's a marriage quote from the study. So if you can bring that one up. It's interesting. This was from the survey, the National Marriage Project. It says, our first major conclusion challenges what we'll call the Vegas fallacy. The idea that what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. Actually, what people do before marriage appears to matter. Specifically, how they conduct their romantic lives before they tie the knot is linked to their odds of having happy marriages. Super interesting as that kind of, it expands more on that. But that stays in, or what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. It's almost what happens before my marriage and coming in my marriage. They're like, that is a lie. That is not true. As they survey married couples, they're like, man, the decisions that you make, the things that you're bringing into that marriage is going to affect the, the happy marriages. That was like one of the metrics that they were studying for, is like, is it a happy marriage? And it actually taught, in marriage, from the secular perspective or cultural landscape, there is the acknowledgement that what you're bringing in or the decisions that you make prior will affect the happiness of your marriage, which obviously they're interested in studying the happiness of marriage because I think in the cultural landscape, happiness is the goal. Like, that's what our kind of culture values, is we want you to be happy. So even this study, I think, shows something about, we want to study happy marriages because it's like, oh, that's the point. I'll just kind of end there. There's the marriage as a contract, but
yeah, contract would be like you put in 50, I put in 50, it makes 100. But I think in the way that God views marriage is each person needs to give 100% of themselves and almost like lay down their life like Jesus did. So we see that marriage is a picture of the gospel through the lens of a covenant. And so a covenant is when two people commit fully to each other. I feel like I'm blanking on covenant. Like, we're in
I
a
ain't
covenant.
going anywhere. I'm not
Yeah,
going
like you're
anywhere.
not leaving, you're not going anywhere. No matter what happens, you are choosing to stay. And that's what God does for us. His love for us is unconditional, it's unchanging. And he sent his son to die to prove to us that he loves us so much and could have a everlasting relationship with us. So that's like one of my favorite parts about marriage is we get to show to the world this picture of the gospel through the way that we love our spouses in marriage. So this idea of reconciliation, right? Irreconcilable differences, like in marriage, we want to reconcile and forgive each other. We have the hope of that, and we can be ministers of reconciliation to each other. We show grace to each other when we don't deserve it, when we fail each other. I think of 1 Peter 2, 22 through 25. Just an example of like when Jesus was being like spit on and defiled and mocked, like he took it and let it happen and still died for those people. And that's a picture of marriage. Like, not saying that Matt always like slanders me, but like there are times where we'll like...
My bad, is there something that reconcile?
No, but there are times when we hurt each other, and it's like, in marriage, you choose to be like, I'm still staying. Like, even if you hurt me, I can forgive you, and I'm still here. So that example of laying down your life, it's not 50-50, it's giving your 100% and serving the other. Even when they can't meet your needs, even when they can't give anything in return, it's all about sacrifice. And so even the idea that marriage is for your happiness, like marriage is not really about you. Marriage is about God's glory and pointing others to Jesus and even pointing your spouse to Jesus. I think there's a quote that's like, marriage is not to make you happy, it's to make you holy. And I think there's so much joy and good things in marriage, but it's really sanctifying, and God really uses it to make you more like him. And I think even thinking about like sex, I think in dating, there's this pressure, I think in culture, to be really physical and for that to be an expectation. But I think there's like a sanctity in marriage where it's like, I'm giving my full self to one person for my whole life, and having that be such an example of like giving of yourself sacrificially and not giving that to anyone else, and having that be a really special relationship. I think that actually elevates sex more than maybe the world might say. So I think that is a beautiful part of marriage that maybe culture is like, man, Christians are so weird. Like, why are they all like weird about sex? But I think there's a beauty and like a holiness and like a sanctity to sex that I think marriage really displays really beautifully. And I think in even some of the studies Matt was reading to me today, it was saying couples who have sex only with each other, like with your spouse, have better marriage rates and have like proved to have happier marriages.
Yeah, something along the lines of like if there's that narrative of, oh, you need to sleep around so that you have experience or whatever to come in before you come into your marriage. And there are studies that show someone who has many sexual partners prior to marriage, actually the likelihood of them being happy in their sex life and their marriage declines as the amount of partners that they've had prior goes up. And they talk about how maybe a reason for that is because of the like alternatives mindset of where if you do end up getting married with your partner and you had many partners prior, your mind is thinking about and comparing your spouse to your other partners prior, and how there can become this, I'm not happy because I know what it was like with someone else. And so there's studies that do even talk about that, affirm the that narrative that the culture is saying, that's not necessarily true. That does not necessarily relate to a happy marriage, which I think is there's things that we hear that I'm thankful that these studies have been done, because they begin to deconstruct those things that are wrong. And they're doing studies that have nothing to do with like faith or anything. It's just a secular type.
Yeah, so no matter where you are, if you do have a past, if you're thinking like, oh man, like hearing that stat is really discouraging. We believe that God is a God of healing, and he restores and redeems So wherever you find yourself tonight, we want you to know that God sees you, he hears you, he loves you, he celebrates you no matter if you're single, dating, or engaged, or married. He invites you into his presence no matter what season of life you're in. He wants to walk with you, he wants a relationship with you. And I think about 1 John 4 in our prayer time before Sam shared it, but it's such a great, our relationships with people just in general are a way to point others towards Christ and to show them the way we live should be so radically different because of how we love each other that people can't help but be like why? Why is it so different that you love people so well? So that's something that we can be encouraged in.
Yeah, and I'll kind of leave some closing thoughts too. I think even you kind of just heard me go off about the cultural landscape, about dating and the things that we're experiencing with, hookup culture and with, cohabitation or with, what else? I mean, there's other things that I could have touched on, but I just want to encourage you guys, even following Christ, like in representing his kingdom. I believe that just as much as the kingdom work is, yes, sharing your testimony, yes, sharing the gospel, yes, it's inviting people into a personal relationship with him, but just as importantly, Christians, is for us to stand up against certain pieces of our culture that are working against and intentionally hurting the imago Dei, like the image bearers of Christ. And so as we even hear fellas, maybe as we hear men just objectifying women and talking about women in negative ways, kingdom work is to defend the imago Dei. It's to stand up for that woman. It is to speak out against those narratives that our culture are saying. It's for us to not be silent within those conversations, but to speak up and to fight against those cultural narratives and to reframe the way that our culture is speaking about these things. It's to participate in movements that are raising awareness of rape culture and sexual assault and things of that nature. It's the Christians that I believe we actually ought to be a part of calling those things out in our culture and saying, Lord, we have sinned, we have messed up. Our culture, our country is going in the wrong direction, right? I think it's that work there, that standing up there is just as important, is just as much kingdom work as it is of the, let me share my testimony with you, right? As we participate in those conversations, just within life, as we hear them, because we hear them all the time, right? As we decide to, I just heard this narrative and that is wrong. I'm going to speak out against this, right? It's to participate in some of the movements and things that are going on in our time right now. It's platforming things like the Me Too movement. It's not Christians just being like, yo, we just need to talk about the Jesus movement. It's like, no, I actually think this is something that we can platform or even support or engage with, because it might be under the umbrella within our culture that's not necessarily clearly under the church or Christianity or whatever, but as we look at the values of what they represent, they are totally kingdom values. I think we Christians need to be aware of the things that are going on in our culture that are fighting against those lies and actually can participate in them and feel like we're doing kingdom work, because we are protecting and how do I say it? Yeah, protecting the very image of God, the people who God has created, made beautifully, with intention, knows the number of hairs that are on their head. Like God knows these people. We as Christians ought to uplift them and honor our fellow image bearers, right? And so, sorry, I'm going off a little bit there, but that is even just an encouragement of, as we live in this kind of cultural landscape of hookup culture and all those things, Christians, we might need to reframe our perspective of what it means to be disciples within the cultural landscape that we live in the campus cultures that we live in, the classes that we step into. And so it's just a charge to look for those opportunities to fight and to speak out, representing the kingdom in those ways. So
I will close our time in prayer and worship. Come up. Lord Jesus, we come before you and we recognize that you are a God of love and you have so much purpose for our relationships. And Father, we just pray that some of these kingdom values will be true of our relationships. God, I pray for each person in this room no matter if they're single or dating, no matter what you have for their future, God, I pray that they would be near to you. And as I think about making decisions for their future and considering how to love people well, that you would be so present in their life and that they would do that kingdom work like Matt was sharing about, that people would look and see that you are so real and so good, and you love people and you love women and you love relationships and you love marriage, and you want to see people flourish and thrive, and you want to see our relationships be really healthy and full of joy. And so God, we thank you for being the author of love and relationships. We also thank you for the single person and for the way we can celebrate all the ways you use each person so specifically, God. So pray for our futures and all the things that you have for us, that we would live out of them in wholeness and in joy, and that we could trust you. God, we love you so much. Amen.